The biggest polypharmacy in the world is free. It's exercise. My suggestion would be, before you worry about all these things you can add in, ask yourself, is my training dialed in? Make sure that's in place before you build on top of that.
It's time to sit down, keep it real, and cut the bullshit. Welcome to Table Talk. Anthony, welcome back. You were out here with Tom on podcast number 403, talking about peptides and all that such, and we'll circle back to that a little bit later. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to bring you back out because I've known you for a long time, acquaintances for a long time, and don't really know your origin story. And I don't know if Tom really kind of went into that too much, but you've been around this field industry. It's broad term, like strength fitness industry for, God, forever. So how did you first get into it? Because you were somewhere when I was going through my stuff here, you were 117 pounds.
Buck 17, dripping wet.
And this was in high school?
Uh-huh.
Any sports at all?
I played soccer my whole life, indoor, outdoor, traveling, absolutely loved it, and wrestled twice. Kind of a funny bit of trivia for people. I went to boarding school my junior year of high school, and I went to the school that Ric Flair went to. So that was kind of exciting. But
why the boarding school?
Honestly, my parents wanted some time together. My mom had been in the hospital for a while, and just to reacquaint, the thought was maybe sending my brother and I off to boarding school would let them reconnect, so better foundation. And it worked. And I always get excited about experiences like that where I'm going to meet new people, and especially going to Ric Flair's boarding school. How cool is that?
Was it was a wrestling boarding school, or was it a military boarding school, or?
No, it was just a co-ed boarding school. It was Wayland Academy in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. And I think we had almost as many people at the boarding school as there were in the whole town. But we went there, and it was my first experience, like kind of being away from home, where there's that independence. We have dorms, we go to classes, come back, and you have to study, which I didn't do a great job of.
Mm-hmm. And how disciplined was it? I'm asking because my youngest we didn't send, I mean, that sounds brutal. We enrolled him in a military type boarding school when like junior high-ish for a couple of years. And he liked it. You know, it's like, I didn't know how it was going to go.
Yeah.
Right. And so how was the discipline?
The discipline was, I wouldn't say they were extremely strict, but they gave you the mindset to kind of learn what's going to work for you. For me, it was a great experience that I'm mildly dyslexic, and I learn things incredibly fast, but I learn them through conversation. And if I'm sitting in a classroom that's small where I can interact with people and ask the annoying number of questions that I always ask, I pick stuff up great, and it's a lot of fun for me. But in traditional high school where it's a larger classroom, and that works great for some people, I'm reluctant to ask questions because I know people get annoyed when people ask questions, and the reading part it's a disconnect for me. So that's how I've always learned best. So circling back to your question about the discipline, I'd say the discipline was comparable to what you'd have in a regular school, but the class size and how individualized it could make the learning plan for me were the big benefits.
Now, were you playing soccer while you were there too?
That year, actually, I didn't play soccer. That was the one year I got to play football. And really funny story there. We talked about me only being 117 pounds dripping wet, and my parents felt bad about sending me to boarding school. I wanted to play football my whole life, and my mom and dad are like, you'll get absolutely demolished out there. So when I went to boarding school, all the kids are small, and my parents are like, you still want to play football? We'll let you play. The funny thing is, and they didn't know this, and I certainly didn't know this going in, all the schools in our division were prep schools that actually recruited kids. We had grown-ass men in there just laying us flat. I think it had been 2 years since our varsity team won a game, and if I remember correctly, we might have won 2 games that year, but the only one I remember the varsity squad winning was the other team almost didn't have enough players because of academic probation.
Mhm.
So it kind of gave us all right, well, they're
Yeah,
going to get tired by the fourth quarter. Maybe we'll make something happen.
yeah, maybe you'll score.
Yeah.
So what was it like going back to school, or did you graduate there?
So I moved back to live with my parents, and then my senior year of high school, we actually moved to Ohio. My dad was changing careers. He was a professor at Purdue for a long time in psychology. I think that's how he was able to tolerate me.
Mhm.
And my mom was a guidance counselor. So between the two of them, big heart and lots of tolerance for.
Yeah, a lot of conversations.
Yeah. And when we moved to Ohio, my dad was changing into private practice for psychology, and I just went there my senior year of high school. I didn't play sports because all I could think about was just graduating as fast as I could and getting back to West Lafayette, where I grew up with my friends, going to Purdue. And honestly, I was just thinking about hanging out with my friends and
Mhm.
taking enough classes that my parents wouldn't be upset.
When did training come into the whole picture?
So when I moved back to Purdue, I got accepted into Purdue. When I went back to Purdue, um, I was out with my girlfriend at a bar, and probably about 3 in the morning. The bars stay open a little later in Indiana. There was a fight that broke out across the bar. You know, people get a little alcohol in them later in the night. It's going to happen. Jokingly but seriously, she mentioned, because she was 118 pounds. I probably shouldn't have said that on air. She was 118 pounds. And she's like, you realize if that would have been a little closer, maybe I would have been the one jumping in front. And that's when it really resonated. I'd always kind of fooled around with working out and really enjoyed it, but nothing formal. So I was like, I'd really like to get stronger. I'd really like to learn how to do this. So I think it was 2, 3 days later, there was a chiropractor who also had a nutrition store. And I went in there, and, Chad Coy.
Mm-hmm.
So Chad was working there, and man, he is just incredible. Everything I've got, I'm so grateful for him. So I went in there and told him, I want to start working out. And I think I fumbled around a little bit. And he was so serious. I mean, I was scared to death of him, but I knew he could help me. And he's like, all right, we'll start working out. You're going to show up here and we'll train together. First time I show up.
Did he have his gym at the time?
No, this was, we were training down at Brown Street Levy. I can't remember what the club was called, but just kind of a local gym there in Lafayette. So I showed up for training and I had no idea what to expect. I think he put like 135 pounds on the bar. And I was like, for the love of God, you're going to be picking me up off the floor. And Chad's big guy, having him back there, I was like, well, he could probably curl this. I'm fine. So obviously not.
Was he competing at the time?
No, I think he might have been assistant strength and conditioning coach at Purdue at the time.
Okay. All right.
So he was still in college at the time. So I got through the workout because no matter what, I wasn't going to quit. And that's kind of how I got my fiance, how I've been able to succeed. I'm determined about something when I want to do it. And I think like it kind of resonated with him. Like he's really serious. He's going to show up. And he kind of made me his project. It was the coolest thing. I would go over to his apartment and literally like a silver mixing bowl, like that you'd use to make cake batter, would fill it up with oatmeal, cherry pie filling, and egg whites. And he'd be like, eat. And I mean, I was, you get full.
Yeah.
I'm not getting this down. And he'd give you that look and I'm like, I'm getting this down. So I'd eat, I'd be in a food coma. I'd wake up and he'd be like, eat again. This happened like 6 times a day. And in 6 months, and it's hard for people to believe when I tell them this, but honest to God truth, 6 months, completely natural, 117 to 185. I lost 2% body fat. Strength went up. We were training. It was kind of like an Ellington Dardenne type of workout, 1 set to failure, generally 10 to 20 exercises. But when we say failure, it was like real failure. Like having Chad back there was the difference between.
Was it going past failure though too?
On some
Kind of
things,
like with
yeah.
the HIIT training stuff. So there's strip sets and force reps and
We did a couple of strip sets and
yeah.
four streps, yes. Strip sets, not as much. It was more just when I physically couldn't move the bar and Chad felt like he was getting a second workout for the day. That's when I just kind of roll off to the side, find my corner, and sleep until the next time.
This is interesting to me because I mean you're dating yourself. I don't want to put dates on all this for sure, and because I've known Chad for a long time, and the first time I met him was a long time ago, and he had a gym and he was already competing in strongman, and you're training with him before any of this even happened, which is kind of crazy to think about. Did he have any aspirations then for strongman, or was it just train?
Back then it was actually powerlifting, and we went and did a powerlifting meet, and I was actually like, I knew him from the time that he met his first wife and they opened the gym in Kokomo. I knew both of them, but with Chad, you could tell he's just such an intelligent guy and so focused that as soon as he decided, I remember him telling me he was going to have a gym in Kokomo. Randomly, it came up in conversation, and I'm thinking to myself, this will probably be open by next week. I mean, he is a doer and he follows through.
How did you guys find powerlifting? And then when you competed, I assume it was in multiplier gear, right? Or was it raw?
It was raw, and the powerlifting just came about through with the training, the one set to failure. I was getting a lot stronger than I ever expected I could. And at my body weight, for the raw powerlifting, I could be competitive, and my bench sucked, but my squat was pretty decent and deadlift wasn't too bad. So he just kind of suggested, hey, you should do a powerlifting meet. I mean, you're training and, train for something. I always wanted to do bodybuilding and just look decent in a pair of shorts and be able to get some of those girls that when I weighed 117 pounds told me they'd be the one jumping in front.
Yeah.
But I was like, powerlifting, that sounds pretty cool. And I really like data and metrics. So the fact that there's an objective way to measure if I'm making improvement, did I get stronger? What are my numbers? If I do this with my training, will it improve next time? That resonated with me. I had I guess the term would be power building focus, where after that, it was still always about, is my squat improving? That was always my best lift, but still wanting to put on the muscle size and continuing to learn about the process. Chad was actually, and it was funny, I remember he got a job there was a company called Palco, and they did supplement distribution for a lot of gyms and health stores. And I would go on the road with him for trips, like when he was driving around just on the Indiana stuff, because I'd get to talk to him and pick his brain. And he was so generous with his knowledge. And I was always asking questions about, what else can I do to improve my training? What about the nutrition component around it? If this works this way, is this something I could use? And he was the one that kind of encouraged me, like, you're really thinking about this stuff. Great. And I'm happy to answer these questions for you, but I think you want to learn about it on a deeper level. And he introduced me to Mark Banter, who competed in NABA. I think he won the Universe. I couldn't tell you what year, and Mark was doing stuff with John Perillo. So that's how it kind of bled over from that beginning where it was the Ellington Dardenne to more of a bodybuilding approach, thinking about the role nutrition and supplementation plays.
What were you studying at the time?
I was doing my best just not to fail out. I would take the core courses. I didn't really have a focus. When I went into college, the thought was, I always liked science, but I get headaches if I look through a microscope for too long. And with math, I can do it in my head pretty effectively, but if I write it down on paper, I switch numbers. So it was really trying to find something that I could just go to school and not have to take too many of those courses that are uncomfortable for me. So I went into psychology. That's what my dad did, and figured, I can handle talking to people pretty easily. And if I get better at it, I can learn more. And on the side, because of my interest in bodybuilding and nutrition, I was doing just a ton of independent reading, everything I could get my hands on. And I was consuming it slow, because reading disability, but one of the things I learned to do that was really helpful for me is I'd read a paragraph and then I'd out loud ask myself a question about it and think about it and wonder something. And it's kind of funny, the way I read a book like that is after I ask myself the question, if I can't answer it, I'll flip back, if it has one, to like the appendix, see where the subject is. I'll go over there, I'll read that with the goal of being able to answer that question and then kind of go back. So I'm like a ping pong ball. When I read a book, I just bounce around and try to answer questions as I'm going.
Now, do you still do it that way now?
So now I've found some really effective learning hacks for me. I still, if I was going to read something front to back, that's how I would go about it. For me, the couple things that have really been helpful, like a lot of people, I can have a short attention span if it's not something I'm fascinated by. So I set a timer for 3 minutes and I make myself just read for 3 minutes. And no matter what, I'm focused for 3 minutes, easy to do. When the timer goes off, if I feel like, all right, I'm starting to gain a little traction, this is interesting enough to continue with, I'll set a timer for 20 minutes and I'll study for 20 minutes. And in that time I'm studying, I'm simultaneously making flashcards. I find that if I write something and I'm reading it out loud and the speed that the information coming in is appropriate, that I have better attention. So at the 20 minutes, when that timer goes off, no matter what, I just go, I walk around, and I just think about what I learned. And I'll generally do the equivalent of about 2 hours of those type of blocks. And the walk isn't anything long. Not like I'm taking a 30-minute walk. It could be something as simple as I stand up, I go outside, get a little bit of sunlight, or I chase my dog around the house a couple laps. But breaking it up like that really seems to, in the chunks, seems to help. I remember learning from Charles Poliquin that we retain 90% of the first and last 5 minutes of an hour and less than 10% of the hour in between. And I know in my own experience that those little blocks of input, I can remember almost every single thing. But when I start to, you know how some people cram for a test, if I try to do that, forget about it. I could spend 6 hours reading, understand everything in the moment, and have almost no ability to recall it. So
that's interesting. We can stay on this topic a little bit, because one of the things that I learned through college, because when I came up through school, it was just LD. We didn't have all these other acronyms for all these different things. It's just LD, right? And and I hated college for, until I found classes I wanted to take. But I would cram, like you were talking about, and just hope to pass. I mean, that's all I gave a shit about, just pass. Because powerlifting was kind of the main thing anyhow. And then it came to the point where somebody taught me how to make these cheat sheets, right? And I would take this piece of paper and I'd write in real small print all these blocks of all these different topics, and then tear them apart, and I could put it in my palm if I had to look at it. But what I found is I never had to use it. Because the focus to be able to stop and then to write what was it. Basically, it's kind of a little bit like you're doing. Like, here's the main topic here. Then I'm going to write the bullet points to that topic here so I can kind of remember that. And it's in small print, so I got to really focus even more. And I was always prepared to cheat. Always. I mean, there were some, when it was a bigger class, 100 people or whatever it was, I didn't even bother tearing it. I just had the sheet. Because the tests were always going to be paper, and there were only 3 or 4 pages. And as soon as they passed the test out, I just threw the sheet underneath it because it looks like all the other paper. But I never had to use it. And my takeaway from that, which I still kind of do now, is the note cards. I don't use that, but I'll write the things down, right? And then the breaks are another thing that I call it like a subject break, because sometimes the time doesn't really work because you're not through that subject yet. Right. Then I'll break and then just walk around just to kind of clear my head, to kind of refocus on the whole thing and go back. But I think these are important for people, because there's the other thing that I'll do is I'll read, and I don't even like them, but I'll read fiction books. But the problem you can run into when you read fiction books is you can get by with skim reading. Like the whole page, and you still know what the story is doing. You can't do that when you're trying to actually study in-depth stuff,
Yeah.
right? Because you'll skim right past through the main thing. But when I read fiction, it forces me to actually kind of read,
Yeah.
and it's no risk.
Yeah.
Like I can read it and you can ask me, what book did I read over, vacation? Like,
Uh-huh.
I don't fucking know. Right. I know when I was reading,
Yeah.
I know. But I think these hacks are important for a lot of people because I'm sure you're the same way. We'll speak to people and they're just like, no, I don't read. I don't comprehend very well. So
Yeah.
they're just kind of like, fuck it. And
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, that's not going to help a whole lot
Yeah.
because you can learn a lot by talking to other people for sure.
Yeah.
But how do you know that they're not full of shit?
Yeah. You have to trust the source it's coming from.
Yeah. You got to be able to vet it some way.
Yeah.
At what point then did your focus really come into the training and the nutrition? Because it fell more on the nutrition, I believe.
So the training, I felt like it was pretty basic in the sense that the stuff that's out there has been out there for a long time. There have been some refinements to it, but nutrition at the time, and this is going to date me, everybody was doing the really high carb diets. And I wanted to understand why it worked for some people and why it didn't work for other people. And that got me reading about metabolism, and that got me reading about hormones, and that got me reading about, just the whole rabbit hole you go down. So I was always interested in training and I always kept up with it, but it felt like proportionately to give numbers, like for every 2 things that I'd want to read about training, there were 20 things I'd want to read about nutrition to better understand how I could leverage that to support those 2 new training things. So I was learning in parallel, and for job wise, I was doing training for people. But what I started to discover through conversations with my clients and everything, a lot of people are looking for some guidance around nutrition, and it's hard to know where to start. There's all this information out there. And it's not even that it's inaccurate information, it's that it's context dependent information that, circling back to a high carbohydrate diet or a low carbohydrate diet or everything in between, these have all worked and there's all good research to back them up. But in terms of picking which one's going to be right for the person and their training, that there's real opportunity there for people to learn more about that. And from all the stuff I was taking in, I was able to help with that. And it opened up a whole new client base to me. That there were a lot of great strength training coaches, and I'd honestly say some much better than me, but the piece they were missing was the nutrition. So it created this ecosystem, and they say your network is your net worth. And I'm so grateful for the network I had. The ecosystem was, if there was somebody that was outside of my lane for what I was comfortable with for training, I had a great base of trainers I could send them to. And I told them, you're going to be a better person for this client than I am. I'm happy to handle their nutrition. I'd love to learn about what you're doing with them because it's something I don't know. And if you'd be open to collaborating with me on this, you handle their training, you get the client, I'll just handle the nutrition and supplements. 100% of them were on board for that.
The other day I went to McDonald's, and after I paid, I had sticker shock. And then I kind of realized that meal prep services are actually more affordable than getting fast food, and it's way better for you. Today, I'd like to speak to you about Visionary Meals. Visionary Meals is a Central Ohio meal prep company that sources their ingredients through local farmers. 90% of the ingredients are all locally sourced, 100% gluten-free, with a customized meal selection that is beyond anything I've ever seen before. And I've used a lot of meal prep companies in the past. I'm sure you have as well. They have a completely customized section where you can build your own meals. You can scale up the protein with each meals. They rotate the meals every single week. And they have an RD on staff that helps with the receipts and does one-to-one nutritional counseling. One of my favorites through them is the barbecue beef bowl, which is just amazing. They have tons of locations throughout the region, or they'll bring the food to you. Go to visionarymeals.com and check out the variety of the food they have there. Hopefully before the end of the year, they're going to be able to ship nationwide. Use the code TABLETALK10 for 10% off your first order. Now, in the early days, what was the demographic of the client that you would be working with?
So the very first clients I worked with, funnily enough, were just friends. I think a lot of people start there. And honestly, it was just friends that were like, you were a buck 17, now you're a buck 85. Like, can I go work out with you? And I started just, they'd work out for free. And Chad pointed out to me that, hey, you're paying for training. And it's not wrong to charge people to pay for training with you. Don't think about it like you don't deserve to be paid. Think about it like this is how you invest in your education so you have more to give to them. And that was really what it took for me to kind of think of it in terms of a business and something I could do and feel comfortable charging people for, because I genuinely want to help people. And I know how exciting it was for me to go from 117 to 185, but to continue to educate myself, I have to be able to pay for it. And until one of those lottery tickets hits for me, and my dog develops less of a treat habit, I've got to keep some income coming in. So
Was the consultations that you were doing there, were they nutrition or were they training or were they both at that time?
it was a little bit of both. My friends wanted to know what I was eating, what supplements I was using, and how I was training. And from there, it was really like the people you train are your best marketing. They all had different jobs, and people they worked with would be like, wow, you're really making improvement. And they'd be like, well, you should go talk to Anthony. So I was getting these referrals that way, and then referrals from them. So you'll get a kick out of this story. The only advertising I ever did it was terrible, absolute bust. And again, this is going to date me. This is before we really had the internet or websites. I went and I photocopied 500 flyers, piece of paper that had Anthony Castore, personal trainer. I'll help you put on muscle and I can help with your nutrition. I mean, it was that basic. And I went through the parking lots and I put it under all the windshields until I passed out 500. Number of calls I got back, 0.
Yeah. Should have been 5,000. Maybe you would have got.
Yeah.
Were these in person or were they online?
In person.
Okay. So, and would you say predominantly Gen Pop?
Gen Pop, yeah. There were a couple that just by happenstance, they didn't choose me because I was great at training athletes. They were athletes and I was the only trainer that they had been referred to. And I also did nutrition. So it put me in a unique space. And I told them, I've never trained somebody for sport, but I do understand putting on muscle. So let's see how it goes.
Would it be safe to say most of these were probably weight loss, nutrition based? The reason I'm saying this is when I was still working as a trainer forever ago, when you're looking at the nutrition and the strength, there's two facets going on with this demographic that we're talking about. The first one is you're not guaranteed they're going to show up 3 times a week to train.
Yeah.
Right. And even if they do, and it's a half hour per session, how much weight loss are they really going to have if their diet is for shit? Right. The only real lever that they have to lose the weight they want to lose is the nutrition lever. And I was a little handcuffed because it wasn't a corporate club. So we can educate, but we can't prescribe, right? Because you got to be a registered dietitian to do that. And so my out for that was we had a registered dietitian that I just referred to, and it worked really well because my passion was more in the strength. So it's like, okay, you work with, it would be like if you were doing that, like you work with Anthony, I got your training. And then in 8 weeks, when we reassess everything, it's like, well, you're still fat. You didn't lose anything. Did you call Anthony? So I loved it because it completely took it off of my plate.
Yeah.
Because it's like, look, your push-ups are better, your squats better, your flexibility is better, your endurance, all these metrics are better. The only one that's not, and the one they care about the most, it's not mine. That's on them to be able to do that. So I can see how that can become, especially if you have a passion in that, the more attractive lever, because it's the one that's going to work the best. Because once that is even half dialed in, they're going to start losing weight.
Yeah.
Right. So did you see kind of the same thing as what I'm saying there?
Yeah. In fact, that's exactly what happened. And what was so cool about it is I kind of leveraged that when they came to me, and now it wasn't just me telling them they had to eat better. They saw they were getting stronger and they had a good program in hand, but they, to your point, weren't making the progress. So there was less reluctance to try something new. and more of this. Well, if this is what's holding me back, I don't feel like doing it, but I'm not going to get my goal if I don't do it. So with that buy-in to start with, it made it a little bit easier to say, well, let's start with this.
So what made you want to dig deeper than just trend level based information?
I've always been curious to the point that it usually annoys people when I go to conferences that I I just have this burning desire to know everything down to the most fundamental level so that I can explain it to other people. And if there's anything that I don't understand on something, if there's that, well, what about this? Then to me, there's something else to learn. And to me, the value of that, when you have that first principles level of knowledge about a subject, whether it's training, nutrition, peptides, anything, when you have a solid foundation you can build on, everything you start to learn kind of falls into place. So in terms of organization of information, and not just being able to take it in, but to recall it, because now you understand why it's there. You think about where it fits in, and you think about kind of upstream and downstream. You can't build any of this until you've built underneath it. So I guess the short answer to your question would be I have a passion for knowing literally everything. The best illustration of this, my fiance and I, whenever we watch TV, like I literally can't sit through a TV show. It could be anything. I mean, it could be one of her shows that she watches that I have no interest in, but somebody will say something about, I don't know, a bridge, and I'll have to know when was that bridge built structurally? Why did they make these choices? Why is it over here instead of here? And I can spend 4 hours reading about a bridge that just flashed across the screen. And it's a little weird. And at first it was kind of a point of contention. She's like, well, you just stop reading and looking things up and watch TV. But now I think she would consider it one of my more endearing qualities, and she's learned to live with it. Thank God.
So when we're looking at just the nutrition across the board, so it's, if I look at strength and conditioning and I look at all the different programs and everything that's out there at the trend level and distill it down, they all kind of distill down to the same principles, right? So the first principle theory, whatever. And nutrition, when you distill all those down, what does it come down to as far as this is the base? Because I think this is what people are missing with all that, is because we can say it's just basic proteins, fats, carbs, alcohol, calories, whatever we're going to,
Sure.
right? But it's more, it distills down more than that. And I think if people can understand what that base is, then they can look and see, well, this is why this here may work for some and not for others, but all of them should have this base foundation. So what would be that base foundation people should know for nutrition?
I think at the most basic level, when we think about nutrition, it's as easy as nutrition is fuel. That we know if we eat nutrition, we have energy available and our body can use that energy. And then when we start to build that most fundamental principle out a little bit, the body has a choice what it's going to use for fuel. It can use glucose, carbohydrates. It can use fats. It could use proteins. And then when we think about those three categories, we can think about, well, where would those go? Just kind of a quick rundown. We could go into more detail if you like, but just so people can use this immediately. When I think about fats, I think about membranes. And when I think about proteins, I think about structure, tissues. When I think about carbohydrates, I think about glucose, like turbo fuel, something we use really quick. And there's certainly other things those things do, but if we can just kind of put it into those three buckets and those three functions, we can start to build that out a lot.
Now, does it pull in the order of carbohydrates, then fats, then protein, as far as what the body needs for the energy?
This is where it gets really cool. And this is where I've always been so fascinated with this. So I'll give a couple different scenarios and explain why, in my opinion, one might be more carbohydrates, more fat, or more protein. So we'll take, for instance, somebody who's doing strength training 4 times a week. And They're doing a little bit of walking outside the gym, maintaining their zone 2, and their goal is to put on muscle. And what I'm thinking about with it, we'll say they're doing hypertrophy training, and the definition of hypertrophy training I would use would be 8 to 12 reps and 3 to 5 sets. I know that's kind of broad, but I'll tie
Yeah.
it in. And we'd say the rest periods are going to be a little bit shorter, so 90 to 180 seconds, depending if it's one exercise, or even as low as 10 seconds if it's a superset, compared to if they were training for powerlifting, 3 to 5 minutes between a set. So if we think about what does the cell need to succeed in that environment, it needs quick energy. Where's it going to get quick energy from? If we think about if we're breaking down fat and we're using that for energy, the good news is we can make a lot of ATP from it. And ATP is the checking account our body uses to pay debts to our immune system, our muscles, whatever. If we think about that, energy's coming in a little bit slower. If we're doing something where we have really short rest periods in between, for example, supersets, that's probably not going to be the best way to supply that energy. So we're going to need some more glucose in there. And if we think about what's happening during that training, we're going to upregulate glucose storage enzymes. And that's going to help us pull more glycogen into the cell. And when the cell gets more glycogen into it, water follows, so it's going to swell. So hypertrophy or sarcoplasmic hypertrophy.
Is it still going to hit the glycogen first before it's going to go to any fat source? Because that's the most readily available?
Generally, the decision the cell's going to make, at first we have that glycogen in our liver, so it's going to access that first. That's the easiest for it to get to, and really quick energy. When it starts to run out of that, depending on the energy demands, that's where, if you think about if you're drinking carbohydrates during a workout, you're giving it the choice to use glucose instead of having to start to break down fats for energy. And there'd be times that either could be beneficial, but just in general terms, the way the cell is thinking is, if I need quick energy, glucose first. If I have a little bit more time to make energy, that using fat is going to give me more of an energy bank account. And instead of working paycheck to paycheck, like I've got some savings built up.
All right. And then the glycogenesis, or the protein breakdown, only comes into place when those two are kind of exhausted.
Yeah. So a good way to think about when we hear about gluconeogenesis, and the way that I remember that, glucose sounds a lot like glucose. So glucose, sugar, neo, new, and then genesis, creation. So when we think about when we're creating new sugar from protein, what happens is that energy substrate, and when I say energy substrate, this would be fat or glucose, is not available. The cell's energy sensing mechanism is kind of in the red, and it's saying we need something to run on. And the emergency generator or backup fuel becomes that breakdown of protein through the liver, creating glycogen. It's not a very efficient process, and obviously we'll want to keep our protein. So that's why when we have these other substrates available, it can prevent muscle loss.
Well, from a financial perspective, it's also the most expensive
for sure
energy that you're going to pay
yeah.
for, because the proteins are more expensive than the carbs.
Atrophy of the muscle and atrophy of the wallet.
Yes. Well,
yeah.
I often wondered, when you're looking at the super high protein diets, that essentially that's what's going on, is what you're talking about. So you're just paying more money for the same energy source, essentially. I guess there's a couple other processes which I don't believe would burn more calories to make it actually worthwhile for that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that when people are eating a really high protein diet and they don't have carbohydrates or fats in there, that this is an oversimplification. And but generally speaking, a good way to think about it is whatever macronutrient is the most present, your cell is going to generally make the decision to use that, assuming healthy cell, normal conditions. And if we think about that, if we're taking in, say, random numbers, 400 grams of protein, 50 grams of carbohydrates, 100 grams of fat, the cell's thinking to itself, I need this fat for membranes. And this glucose, my brain needs that, so does my heart. And I'm going to run out of that pretty quick. So extra calories are coming from protein. Let's just upregulate all the things that are going to make that process a little bit more efficient of breaking down that protein so that we can meet those demands of the neuron, the immune system, the muscles, all that stuff. So it does really become expensive fuel.
Well, if protein ends up being the most important macronutrient, well, I don't want to say that, right? If it ends up being one of the most important macronutrients for recovery, muscle building, and so forth, I would tend to think that you would want to have, first off, you got to figure out how much that you're going to really need. And I think that conversation gets a little screwed up because it kind of depends upon how many carbohydrates and fats that you're going to have. Because if the carbohydrates are going to be real low, then you're probably going to need more protein because it's going to kind of be used as a carbohydrate to be able to put in there. So the protein, the amount of protein to me would seem it's going to be highly dependent upon the amount of carbohydrate that's in there. So if it's a higher carbohydrate diet, you probably don't need 2 grams per pound or whatever some dumb shit tells you that you have to have. It may be as low as less than a gram per pound if it's all being utilized for exactly what it needs to be utilized for, right?
Yeah.
Would that be safe to assume?
Yeah. And in fact, that's a great launch pad for when we think about a bodybuilder who's dieting and we hear about they're increasing their protein and decreasing their carbs. And it is expensive fuel, but let's think about why they would do that. And then I think people maybe have a better understanding of like, this isn't the way we eat all year round, but for this specific context, it makes sense. So if we were to take out 5 grams of carbohydrates and add in 5 grams of protein, even though the calories don't change, there's a higher thermic effect of food. And because we're training more frequently and we're doing more things to expedite that fat loss process, it's harder for us to recover. So we need to have extra protein available for tissue, and we need that reserve because we've taken some of the carbohydrates out. And if we continue to do that, the things that are going to happen, because there's generally going to be more of an insulin response from carbohydrates than protein. So if we continue to decrease the carbohydrate amount and we increase the protein, we've got less insulin. And if we use fat as kind of that buffer, fat is more insulin neutral and it protects those membranes. So when you think about if we're working out really, really hard and we're using a lot of glucose and cells just spitting out ATP, that's a lot of oxidative stress. And to manage that oxidative stress, we need to have things to repair those membranes. Otherwise, what we end up with is a bunch of broken factories for making energy. That's not going to be helpful. It's kind of like if you were going to make gym equipment and you had an amazing factory to do it to start with, and you're cranking out the gym equipment, and then people are like, well, I want to order more. So you build 10 more factories and they're keeping up. But over time, those factories start to break down. Obviously, you're going to repair the factories. And then when those are repaired, then you're going to build more instead of just saying, well, we're going to run them into the ground and just build brand new factories. That would be expensive and ineffective. And the ones that are being manufactured in the broken factories would maybe have some defects to them. So your cells are really the same, that when they're thinking about if we want to make more mitochondria or if we want to fix the ones that we have, that's why I always tell people that structure has to precede function, that we have to think about the boring stuff, making sure we have the stuff in our diet our body needs to repair, that we're allowing time for those adaptations to happen. So by adaptation, if we're thinking at a cellular level, that's just assembling those things, taking those pieces and putting them where they need to go and cleaning out the bad pieces.
So it's, if we're looking at somebody that would be in a surplus in excess of 500 extra calories per day, then how important are those macronutrients going to be as far as percentages wise? Because it would seem like they're just covering all their bases anyhow.
Yeah. So when the calories are that high, most of the time they're going to have their micronutrients and what the cell needs, like glucose and those sort of things, taken care of. Where it gets really interesting, a little bit more granular, but I'd be happy to unpack it if you want. So when we think about what happens when we're making these energy factories, and for context, when I'm talking about an energy factory, this will take everybody back to 6th grade biology. We're thinking about the mitochondria. So when we think about what's the process of making new factories and better factories, so when we exercise, what's happening is we're using these things a lot. And when we use them a lot, what's happening, just imagine a supervisor's walking around in there and he's identifying the parts of that mitochondria that are breaking down, and they're chopping it off, pushing it off to the side for cleanup. And you've got these, we'll call them fragments. So maybe 3/4 of a mitochondria, or 80% of a mitochondria, or 20% of a mitochondria just floating around. When we have a chance to recover, what happens is, if the process is working, the cleanup crew comes over, it picks up all those broken pieces, and now all these parts that are floating around, the 2/3, 3/4 of a good mitochondria, have the ability to fuse together. And when they fuse together, what's so cool is, it's like going back to the analogy of exercise equipment factory. The whole factory is not shot. Maybe it's just one or two machines. So what if you could take the good machines from another one, just repair the structure, the actual warehouse, and instead of having to buy all new equipment every time, recycle the parts that you have so they can be used. It's cost effective, and if they're good parts, in the case of our mitochondria, they even have some battle experience, so they're adept at making good decisions and doing the right thing. So basically, think about it as fission, splitting apart, mitophagy, the cleaning up, and then fusion, putting together. So circling back to the question about high calories, what happens when we have high calories? So when we have a lot of calories coming in, high calories, that's going to be a build signal, mTOR dominant, and that's going to be something that drives more fission, so the splitting apart. And that's why when you think about, well, if we need to get in 500 grams of protein per day, why can't we just eat it all in 2 meals? I'm hungry, I'll eat 250 grams here, and an hour later I'll eat 250. And if we think about what's happening in the mitochondria, it's kind of explained that would be like you're starting to repair those factories. There's still some damage, but then all of a sudden you just started breaking them down again before they're repaired. So there's got to be that fission, mitophagy, fusion. And when we think about meal spacing, and we think about why fasting works, or why the way that I do nutrition on a day where we're training, it's going to be a higher calorie intake, because we have higher throughput, higher energy expenditure, and upregulation of enzymes that are going to help us put those foods where they need to go more effectively. And then on that rest day, I need that cleanup crew in there cleaning up all the damaged parts. So when we're fusing things together, we're not building bad machinery.
I've been training for over 4 decades now, and keeping track of all my training metrics has always been a big part of that. It wasn't until later on that I realized that keeping track of your internal metrics are just as important, if not more important, the longer you're in this game. Most primary care physicians, if you go in for any type of issue, they'll look for what's off, but they're not necessarily looking for how to optimize where your labs are for where you want to go. That's where Merrick Health comes in. Merrick Health does advanced blood work with medical providers around the world and a health coach who helps build a plan around your goals. I worked with Merrick to build a custom lab panel for this show. They have guided optimizations that can help you set you up with a health coach to be able to work through what your goals are, from the prescriptions to supplements, just the whole deal. Don't have to do that. You can just do the lab panels. They have options. You can find this at merrickhealth.com/table talk for 10% off your first order. One of the best decisions that I ever made was to partner with Merrick. So I highly suggest you head over to merrickhealth.com/table talk and get started today. So when you're looking at that, there's digestion is going to play a role here too. It's like, how long is it going to take to get through the stomach and into the intestines, and then release from the intestines into the bloodstream, right? To where, what is it, the amino acid pool, right? Which is circulating throughout our veins pretty much all the time. So the question I always have when you're dealing with timing like that is, how long is it going to take for this just to happen? And then if we were able to track one amino acid that's broken down from that protein that we ingest.
Mm-hmm.
How long is it in the bloodstream before it's actually going to be pulled to be able to be used for that? Right? Because now when you're with that meal timing, you'll have some people that are going to say you could just eat it all in one meal because it's going to sit in the bloodstream for 24 hours or whatever it's going to be. And other ones will make this assumption that, oh no, it's only in the bloodstream for 10 minutes. I'm like, we know that's bullshit. It's not even through it's not even through your intestines in that period of time. And so how does that play the role here?
That's a really good question. And I think I love that you're asking this because people are really, I hope, going to start putting these pieces together. So when we think about amino acids and protein synthesis, and by protein synthesis, I mean if we're eating and we want to build back the muscle that we broke down, there's got to be 20 amino acids present, and there's what's called the rate limiting factor. So imagine those 20, and these are arbitrary numbers. Let's say you have 5 grams of all of them, except for one you have 1 gram of. Specifically, we'll say that's out of the essential aminos. And essential aminos are the ones that you have to get from your diet that your body can't make. So out of those 8, we'll say, they're all at 5, all good, but there's one that's lagging, it's at 1. That's going to be the rate limiting factor. So what happens then is that means you can use baseline 1 to resynthesize new tissue. So all the other amino acids, those are going to get recycled. They're going to float around. And until that rate limiting factor is available, then you're not going to be able to make more tissue. So when we think about things like, a lot of times you'll see people that are eating these huge calorie diets, and completely right on that you have to have a lot of food to put on size. But when you think about the things that can go wrong, I'll use somebody lifting for an example. When we have a lot of food coming in that is and it's just circulating, that's going to cause inflammation, and specifically that's going to raise zonulin levels. And what zonulin does is, when you think about the lining in our gut, it's like these cars that are backed up bumper to bumper, so really tight junctions. So these cars now are starting to back up, and there's space in between there. So then these amino acids and food particles and bacteria, they can sneak through those junctions. And when they're where they're not supposed to be in that contained digestive tract, that's going to create an immune response and inflammation. So a lot of these people that are eating these high calorie diets end up with food sensitivity, bloating, but they know they have to eat. So it's like, oh man, what are we going to do? And when we think about hard training, that can also raise zonulin levels. So circling back to your question about how do we navigate this, that's where we can think about different supplements and peptides to decrease zonulin levels. And anything we can do to support the efficiency or the structure of the gut, so that membrane in there and the integrity of it and the efficiency of the digestive process. And then when we think about, too, the importance of why do we rotate our foods? So if chicken has a really specific, complete 20 amino acid profile, and beef has one, and eggs have one, if we only eat eggs, remember that rate limiting factor that we talked about a minute ago, that's always going to be expressed every time you eat those. And that's going to be more protein in circulation, more increase in inflammation and zonulin, more of those aminos sneaking to where we don't want them to be in a food allergy. So if we rotate our protein sources, the likelihood of us being able to fill that gap of the rate limiting factor is a lot higher. So that's going to improve digestion and utilization of what we're eating.
So with the digestion of the amino acids, the protein is going to be broken down into amino acids or small chains, dipeptides, tripeptides, or whatever. But they all have to be broken down into single, double, or triple just to pass through the intestines, right? So with that being said, the one thing I've always kind of rolled my eyes at, if somebody's selling a product which is this 6-chain amino acid blend, saying that this is going to be the best thing to be able to help support all this other shit, it's getting broken down.
Yeah.
The same way everything else is to pass through. So who gives a shit, if it's the 6 or if it's not the 6? And then with that question, how long do those amino acids stay in that pool? Because it's going to get pulled out of that pool for the recovery based upon when its needs are. right? The carbohydrates, I believe, are stored in the muscle cells and liver and stuff like
Muscle,
that.
liver, yeah.
Where the amino acids, where are they stored? Is
So
it bloodstream?
they'll circulate in the bloodstream. They can be synthesized into new tissue, and then actually, not to get
Yeah.
too off the subject, but when we think about like a bioregulator peptide, those are specific amino acid chains that remain intact. And when we think about proteins in general, or chains of amino acids that are small enough to survive, what's happening is those are sending a signal, and we want those to be the right signal. And for all that we think we know about peptides, we haven't scratched the surface. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of peptides. And if you were to Google every peptide out there right now that like somebody's actually using or studying, it's probably in the hundreds. So circling back to what happens to the amino acids, if they're not being used to support resynthesis of tissue, they can be used for signaling. And if we're sending the wrong signals, and we just don't know, if we're sending the wrong signals, those can be things that are driving undesirable immune system activation, allergic reaction, and at the very least, putting a brake on building new tissue, because the body's always going to try to survive before it grows or thrives. And if there's an insult that it can't identify that's sending a signal that seems like, why would I ever want this signal at this time? Until the body can kind of react to it and figure out what it is, that's where the resources are being allocated.
Now, are most peptides is a broad category, but are most peptides just medium and short chain amino acid?
Good way to think about the peptides is if we think about the smallest chain, so 2 to 4 amino acids, that's going to be a bioregulator peptide. And if we think about up to, I think the current definition is 50 amino acids in a row, that's going to be like when we talk about BPC or GLP-1s, those kind of things, those kind of peptides. And when we think about some other examples of peptides, insulin, that's longer chain of peptides, and that's considered a drug, but it's still a peptide. Or growth hormone would be probably the one most people are familiar with. That's 191 amino acids. And when we think about the length of that chain, different parts of that chain all do different things. So for growth hormone, for example, 191 amino acids, but if we were to just have magic scissors where we could cut it off at 176 through 191, that's the part of that growth hormone that's especially good at signaling for fat loss. And that's why also when we think about and this is going to date me too. I remember back when the Cybergenics was out, and they had, you could take this oral growth hormone formula and 191 amino acids. Even if it was 191 amino acids, to your point, it's going to get cleaved into those smaller groups, and it's 100% not going to signal the way growth hormone would signal, if it even doesn't completely get burned up through digestion. So
there can be, I mean, if you're dealing with different combination, if a peptide can be any different combination of those amino acids in a chain up to 200, we're dealing with infinite numbers of actual peptides that could be put in there.
Yeah.
But they're going to have to be injected because it has to bypass the gut. Right? Because the gut is going to break it down. So with that in mind, how in the hell can they have a pill GLP-1?
So there are certain things they can do to improve the stability. With that one in particular, I don't know the modification they made to it, but some different things that allow things to get through the gut that otherwise might not be able to would be like liposomal, where it's encapsulated and it's protected from that acid going down, and it makes it more permeable through the intestinal lining so it can get to where it needs to go. I think that is actually where, when you think about what we have available right now in terms of these peptides, I don't think there's really a shortage or a gap in terms of things we have that can send the right signal to improve training, improve health, whatever. I think where the opportunity is delivery systems, that when you think about things that can go wrong, if you're injecting stuff, especially from source that's maybe not the best source, the number of things you could be exposing yourself to are really not good. But if these become safe, oral, and stable, and they can be regulated or taken as a supplement, then we can improve the effectiveness and safety for people. So I think we'll see a lot around that stuff.
You've been in the peptide space forever, right? So it's all the way back to Serrano telling me about, peptides 20 years ago, whatever.
Yeah.
Forever. So there's some observations I've kind of had on the space, and because you've been around it forever, you were around it before anybody was talking about it, before it was on the news, and all this other kind of stuff. And as a person from the outside looking in, I see a lot of similarities with what the supplement industry used to be 10 years ago. And the jumping off point I'll put out there would be, with most of the companies that are out there, they can't sell over state lines, right? So they have to set up a website that you're going to have to put a login. Basically, it's some kind of paywall to be able to keep them away from Google, to be able to keep the site up for as long as they possibly can, because when it goes down, they're going to have to create a new one. They can't use payment processors because that's federal, and they got to use Bitcoin or whatever it's going to be able to. So there's that whole thing there. And then the majority of it all is coming from China. And that doesn't mean that it's bad, right? Because I guess you could buy bad shit or you could buy good shit. It's here nor there, because most of the peptides, if you're buying in batches of 1,000, are not that expensive, right? So say a GLP-1, maybe $6, right? A lot of times the bottle is going to cost more than what's in the bottle, right? So it creates this interesting business sphere to where somebody can buy all these for $6 and sell it for 80, which is in fucking it's not as bad as the pharmaceutical companies that are selling it for 3,200. Right. But there is a huge profit margin. In contrast, I'm in retail, and the highest we might see is like 40%. This is like in the thousands of percent. Which creates this opportunity to where they can have influencers be able to speak about their product, and then give them a 10% discount code, and then pay them 20 to 25% for every order that comes in. So now they're in this weird space to where, if I've been approached by a couple of them, so I could do that and make more from one company than all my sponsors combined for the podcast.
Wow.
Just because the average order is going to be between $250 to $300, which is $100 going back to whoever's doing the promoting of all this. And all the people that you see on Instagram, TikTok, and everything else promoting all this, lo and behold, have a discount code for 10% off, to which they're probably getting 25% kickback to them to be able to push that, which doesn't create any incentive for them to really be truthful on what's really working and what's not working, but creates this huge incentive for them to be able to push it all out there, which is interesting to me, because these are the same people that are going to bitch about doctors that have pharmaceutical reps come in and buy them lunch, to be able to push whatever their pharmaceutical product is, where they're actually doing the same thing and probably making 10 times more than the doctor who's pushing the SSRI. You see what I'm saying? So it's funny that this is the business space of all this, right? And then people are trying to figure out, like, what the fuck is worth, what's good, what's not good, because everything's being influenced because of the kickbacks that are on the other end. Try to find somebody speaking about peptides that doesn't have a discount code or that isn't affiliated with any of the zero, right? You see where, and this is the crazy part, because you've been around a long time. This was amino acids, creatine, coenzyme Q10, DHEA 10 years ago. All happening today. So first, is my observation somewhat true?
I'd say spot on. And it's so funny because, first of all, it is spot on that it's hard, because the people that are the loudest and most compelling out there influencing are getting kickbacks from peptide companies. And how I've tried to differentiate myself in the space is I don't pass out affiliate codes, and I try to just inform people, because what people need to understand, I guess, a couple things is, one, even though these are accessible, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be right for you, or they're even going to be effective. And then Two, when you think about just because this influencer said it, what qualifies him as an expert on it? He's saying he used it, but how can you verify that? This is my first principles thing,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't verify it. So when you compare like a research company to a compounding to a pharmaceutical, it's really interesting. If you want, I can kind of explain about the process of the sourcing, how they
Yeah.
originate and filter down. So everything comes from China, the raw material. They come from API, which is an approved pharmaceutical ingredient supplier. And a company like Lilly has an exclusive agreement with a particular API. And when we think about, we have boots on the ground over there that can inspect these APIs, and the ones that a compounding pharmacy are going to source from are going to be ones that are getting audited fairly regularly. So when those get shipped over here, or whatever's happening, and we'll say raw material. So raw material is going to be powder. You can get it from an API over there that's already lyophilized, which means it's going to be powder in a vial. So you just potentially could add the water, mix it up, and inject it. When it comes over here for a pharmaceutical company, it's going to be the powder that's then going to be compounded into finished product, which is going to, if you get SS31 from a compounding pharmacy, it's going to come in a liquid form. If you get it from China, it's going to come in a powder form. And I haven't seen the actual, it was approved on, what was it? I think September something for Barth syndrome, the SS31. I haven't seen the actual pharmaceutical preparation, but people see the huge price discrepancy, and it's like, well, why would I ever pay that much? So just to inform people about what the differences are. So with the API, generally they're going to give you a COA, and what that means is that what they say it is. And maybe those are accurate. Maybe they just made it on Adobe,
Mm-hmm.
and they're going to show you an HPLC, and an HPLC is going to speak to the sterility of it. And let's say 99.5%. What it's not telling you is what's the 0.5% in there. And that could be metals, that could be endotoxins, LPS, all sorts of things that happen when it's manufactured that wouldn't be brought out. And those are the things that could really cause a reaction or a problem. With a compounding pharmacy, the difference is it has to be tested over there. And then when it comes over here, it has to be tested. And it's manufactured at approved facility where they have independent testing done on it. Then after it's made, they do testing again. So it's just that higher level of verification is what you're paying for. And when you think about a company like Lilly, with the amount of money they have and what they could be sold for if something were to go wrong, the amount of testing they do and the detail of testing they do is sometimes 10x what a compounding pharmacy would be. So it's not to tell people that everything you get is going to be garbage if it's research. It's just to hopefully bring a little bit more awareness about there are these different levels of certainty, and you got to make the decision that's right for you. And it's definitely more expensive to buy a compounding than it is to buy a research, and most of the time more expensive to buy a pharmaceutical than it is to buy a compounding. But here's where I'd push back on people, and I think you'll appreciate this. You know, the biggest polypharmacy in the world is free. It's exercise. That for all these cool compounds out there, and I'll be the first to tell you, I've got shiny object syndrome. When
Mm-hmm.
something comes out, I want to read about it. I want to learn about it. But for all these cool things out there, different types of exercise. So whether you're walking or whether you're powerlifting or whether you're doing bodybuilding training, they're going to send a cascade of peptide signals that we're going to adapt to. And the best part about it is they're in the exact right amounts. Our body's done the math for us. And that's why when they say, if you want to put on muscle, work out. If you want to fix depression, work out. If you want to whatever, work out. And it's so cool. I mean, any of those things, I could nerd out on the specifics of what happens, where it happens, how it transfers into whatever. But if people can just, going back to the sourcing thing, think about, my suggestion would be, before you worry about all these things you can add in, ask yourself, is my training dialed in? And if it's not, maybe make sure that's in place before you build on top of that.
I just want to take a moment to let you know about our crew. What our crew is, it allows the show to stay independent, and it's the reason why the podcast is still here now. The podcast is free to listen to, but it's not free to produce. It keeps going because of the sales through Elite FTS, our show sponsors, but more importantly, our crew members. The reason I love this is for many reasons, is it keeps the show independent. So I can pick who I want to speak to. I can pick what topics I want to speak to, and I don't have to be accountable to anybody. I just go off what the crew members want and what the audience wants, and I don't have to deal with all the other bullcrap that's associated with the podcast world. In return, what you get with the crew is ad-free episodes that are released a day ahead of time. You get access to our Discord community, which has AMAs, like 60 ebooks. We try to put a new ebook out every single month. Access to our coaching community with form checks, training Q&As. It also gives you invitations to our training retreats that are out here in the gym once or twice a year. 76% of all the people that joined in 2022 are still members now. Right now, you can either go month to month or get 2 months free with an annual plan. Just look for the link in the description, look at the QR code, or search elitefts.com crew and join today. It means a lot.
The next thing I would look at would be, is my nutrition dialed in? That's what's going to give you the raw materials to build the scaffolding to repair from the training. And actually underneath the training, and this is the most boring stuff, so I apologize to people, the most important things to focus on are going to be your circadian alignment. And I'll just give a simple example so people can really appreciate this. Let's say you're going to eat sweet potato with steak and broccoli. Pretty healthy meal. And if you eat that at 8 a.m. and if you eat that at 10 p.m., it's going to have two different effects in the body. It's the same calories, the same foods, but the reason it's going to have a different effect is because of your circadian clock and what happens. So what happens is when it starts to get dark, we're going to release melatonin. And when we start to release melatonin, that's going to decrease that signaling for insulin. And when we decrease the signaling for insulin, things like carbohydrates are going to have less efficiency of getting cleared and put in the cell. So the takeaway is that's why when you think about that old adage of eating 3 hours before you go to sleep, that's because you still have reasonable insulin sensitivity, and carbohydrates at night can do something positive like increase serotonin. So you're going to have that better sleep and produce the things you need to when you're sleeping. So,
how much of that is the circadian and just the fact that it's night compared to the sleeping part? Because what if you're a third shift worker? Are these things still being down regulated during the night?
So that brings up a really good point and why shift work is so dangerous. And I completely understand that's just what some people have to do. So it's more about damage control in those situations because our clock, our watch in our head is always wound by the natural sunlight around us, whether we're indoors or outdoors. And when we think about, just like a watch, you have to wind it. So how do we wind that watch every day? And the intensity of the sunlight before 9:30 a.m. can be up to 100,000 lux. So just think about that as dropping like some really good winding in a new battery in your watch. It's going to run strong. And for comparison, people talk about, well, I didn't make it outside today, but I've got windows all around my office. It could be as low as 500 or 5,000 lux compared to 100,000 lux. So magnitudes of difference. And when we think about the importance of that in terms of telling our body when to, circling back to the mitochondria stuff, when to clean up, when to make new mitochondria, we think about our insulin signaling, all that stuff, it's time stamped. So specifically with regards to somebody who's on shift work, the things I would think about would be if they're working those hours, we need things that are going to be less of a glucose response, and they're creating a lot of oxidative stress. So we're going to need more things to support the membrane architecture. So plain English, what that looks like is maybe it's not their favorite food, but I tell them to pack a can of sardines and take a baby aspirin and eat a lot of fruits and vegetables. And it's not going to be perfect, but it's going to, with what they have to work with, it's going to be a simple step they can make towards being healthier than if they didn't do that, if they were to eat what they'd normally eat during the day.
So with staying on the sleep topic, because that's a big thing right now, to everybody wants to optimize their sleep. So they're, people that would run in my circles are just pounding NyQuil and Xanax and all this other kind of shit, where the one thing that I'll throw out there, but then I'll let you take over, that if they want to try to optimize their sleep with regular bedtimes and shit like that, is the one thing that everybody forgets is, are you doing anything during the day to even make yourself tired?
Exactly.
Right? Because if you're not training, if you're not walking,
Yep.
if you're not getting steps, you're not doing all this other stuff, then you can't fall asleep. Well, the next day, try to get 10,000 steps in and see how quick you fall asleep.
Exactly.
Right? So there's
Yep.
that, but that's always kind of
Yeah.
left out, right? Because they may just be training 3 days a week and they're going hard on
Yeah.
those 3 days or whatever it's going to be, or they're going too hard and they can't sleep because it's too much. Where the low hanging fruit just seems to be that it's odd in these industries how the lowest hanging fruit always is the one that never gets talked about.
Yep.
Like, just go to bed at 9 o'clock at the same time or close to it. And just start there, and people, I think, would be amazed at
Yeah.
how well that works. Also might be amazed at how hard that is for them to do if they're not doing it. Right. But they'll skip over that entirely, then get all these supplements and all this other kind of stuff, stay up to 11:30, pound all this shit, knock themselves out, wake up the next day and be like, well, that didn't work. Right.
Yeah.
So it's, how do you kind of guide people through this process of trying to get better sleep in a way that's successful? Because I've seen these fucking protocols that are like this much stuff, like,
Yeah.
do this, right?
Yeah.
And you're howling at the moon before you go to bed, and you're,
Yeah.
wearing fucking glasses that probably don't do anything,
Yeah.
and all this other kind of shit, to where nobody's going to be compliant with that.
100%. And I love that you brought up the importance of doing something during the day. That what I tell people is a good night's sleep starts the morning that you wake up. And the things that are going to make you sleep better aren't going to be the things that you're throwing in your system. And I'll explain in a little bit more detail why those are failing in a moment. But just getting back to the question, how would I address this? First thing in the morning when people wake up, I don't care if the sun's out or not, you can put your shoes on, go outside, and if nothing else, just stand out there for 10 minutes. That'll be a step in the right direction. And even if it's dark, the sun rays are still getting through the clouds, so it's winding that watch. And next thing I would tell them to do, and I'll explain this a little bit more further in the conversation, but I would tell them to, like what we were talking about before the podcast, journaling, so valuable. And if it doesn't have to be anything eloquent or profound, it's a thought dump for me. It clears space in my brain so I can think during the day. And sometimes it's more structured than others, but just the act of doing it, starting with 10 belly breaths. And people are so bored of hearing about the breathing, but for autonomic regulation, that's a huge, huge thing. And the other simple thing they can do during the day, as you pointed out, just get steps. That might be parking a little bit farther from the office, that might be taking the stairs, the things people have heard about. Maybe if you're at a desk, when you get a call, you just stand up and pace. Or if you're really weird like me, while your fiance is watching Netflix, pace. That most people probably aren't going to do that.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Those simple things are going to be so impactful for that night of sleep. And then when you think about when you're eating, some simple things you can do. And I always like to give credit where credit's due. So Owen Lacey, brilliant strength coach from Ireland, gave this one to me, and it is one of my favorite things I've learned. He calls it the 5-10-15-20 rule. Easy to remember, 5-10-15-20. All it means is every time you sit down to eat, you're going to do 5 belly breaths. I like to tell people to do 5 box breaths, 5 by 5 by 5 by 5, because it's easier to remember the 5. The reason you're going to do that is it's going to help shift you to a parasympathetic state. When you're in a parasympathetic state, that same food you're eating is going to get managed better. And then the 10 is, and this is do as I say, not as I do. If we ever go out to dinner, people will be like, where's your 10 seconds?
Mm.
Try to set your fork down for 10 seconds in between bites. That's going to maintain the cadence of the meal. I'm a hurricane of teeth and nails, so do as I say, not as I do. 15, chew your food 15 times. The mechanics of chewing releases salivary amylase, which is the enzyme that breaks apart those carbohydrates into the usable glycogen molecules. Makes it easier for body to say, well, these go here, these go here. And then the 20 is just move around for 20 minutes after you eat. And the reason for that is it's called GLUT4 translocation, but without worrying about the big term, just think about that's what your body uses to put glucose where it needs to go. And just moving around is something that's going to improve that. And if you can make that walking, that even signals that energy sensor that's going to let your body know. It's called AMPK. It's going to let your body know to, while you're resting in between meals, call out the cleanup crew. Let's get rid of some of those dead cells and broken parts.
And how's this going to help with the sleeping though?
So with the sleep, what you're doing throughout the day is creating more parasympathetic tone. So when somebody can't fall asleep and their mind is racing, that's a sympathetic state. And if you think about it like a seesaw, you have to have somebody on both sides. But if I've got crude analogy, but if I've got a really fat girl on this side and I'm on the other side, I'm going to be up in the air kicking my legs the whole time, and that seesaw is not going to move. I'll have to call a buddy or two of mine to get that seesaw moving. And with our nervous system, or even if we're talking about building muscle, AMPK and mTOR, that seesaw has to keep moving. And when we do those simple things, journal, breathing, the 5, 10, 15, 20, all of those things are helping to level out that seesaw so that when we go to unwind at the end of the night, our brain's already in a state where it's ready to sleep. And getting that sunlight in the morning is kind of putting that stamp on the clock where the hour hands are, letting us know that, okay, it's starting to get dark. We are getting that signal of melatonin that's going to make us a little bit more tired and help us fall asleep. So it's reinforcing what's naturally happening in our biology. And you'll find that at the very least, your supplement stack is going to shrink considerably, and you can be more specific and targeted with the things that you need. If, for example, somebody has eats right before they go to sleep, I would want to see what their resting heart rate is. That usually, because the food's going to be in your belly and you're going to be pumping blood to the stomach to physically support the digestive process, that's going to increase the heart rate. And if your heart rate falls lower, you're not going to feel as recovered, even if you're getting 8 hours of sleep.
Now, if somebody's using, I'm just going to throw some examples out there. If somebody's using melatonin and for an extended period of time, are they going to become dependent upon that?
That's a really good question. And honestly, I don't know the answer. I've done a lot of reading about it, and I've talked to people a lot smarter than me, and there doesn't seem to be a consensus on that. The other thing to think about with melatonin, and this is probably just going to confuse people further, so I apologize, but it's a really good antioxidant for the mitochondria. So if you have somebody that's doing strength training, has a lot of stress, they're producing a lot of oxidative stress in the mitochondria, and they're having trouble falling asleep, I think you could make a strong case for using it. But if somebody's just taking it because they heard it'll help them sleep, and maybe they're not doing some of those other things that would create that oxidative stress, it could be creating a bigger problem than it's solving on a lot of different levels.
Now, what are the differences with the dosing with melatonin? Because I used to use melatonin, and I forget what the company was, but it was like 1 milligram, 2 milligrams, or whatever it was. And then somebody's like, no, don't take that. Go to this Micro Ingredients, which is a more reputable company, and take 100. Right. So it's, this is a 10 milligram pill. This one's a 1, right? This one that's a 1 is only sold with 50. So I have to think either it's something compounded differently to make that 1 work better. Am I fair in assuming this?
I would think the same thing. To tell you the truth, I really don't fully understand the difference between a microgram and a milligram. My takeaway, for what it's worth, and again, I'm still learning about this, is when we think about micrograms, we're thinking more in terms of a signal or a pulse. It would be like if you gave an employee an instruction to do something, they're likely going to go do it, good to go. if we're thinking about milligram doses, that would be more like you told this employee a couple of times, they're still not doing it. So now you're going to follow them around. And if you see them slacking, you're going to uh, kind of give them a pat on the shoulder and say, let's get this done.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the thinking, and I could be completely wrong on this, but how I think about it, with a microgram dose, you're trying to send that signal, and you're trying to send that signal for the purpose of reminding your body that it should be sending that signal. So just a nudge. But if your body, like me, has lost hearing over time, it might need that push.
Okay. So the strategies for people that wake up to piss,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I got mine down to like one, where there was a time it was like 3 or 4. And because I'm older, most of my friends are like 3 or 4.
Yeah.
So what are some things that they can do to be able to, I don't know if they're going to get through the whole night, but it'd be a good goal to be able to wake up less, because that can be this big sleep disruption too, especially if, I will put this out here, that if you do have to wake up to piss, don't turn the lights on, sit down to pee so you don't pee all over the toilet seat. Don't do anything to make it even worse.
Yeah.
I try to keep my eyes shut. I'll just sleepwalk, like, because I'm afraid that if something comes on, it's going to be worse. But what are there nutritional strategies they can do? Are there certain things that they can do?
Yeah, man, I'm so excited to talk about this one, and great question. So first, intuitively, the things you're doing are brilliant, but I'll explain the mechanism behind it so that people really understand, well, this is actually why. So let's start with, why do people have fragmented sleep when they're waking up through the night if they fell asleep easy? So you fell asleep through, we'll just say they took enough stuff to make themselves fall asleep. What happens when they're waking up, the brain needs energy all the time. Brain is very energy dependent. And if we ate our meal, and one of two situations, maybe we ate 6 hours before we went to sleep, or maybe we ate right before we went to sleep. It sounds like two different things, but remember, it's going to depend on how we're handling that glucose. If we can handle it effectively, where it's getting fed to the brain at an appropriate rate so it maintains energy through the night, we're going to be in a good spot. Now, if we underate and underfueled, the brain needs glucose. So what's it going to do? It's going to release cortisol. And what's cortisol going to do? It's going to increase sugars in the bloodstream. And where's that sugar going to come from? Gluconeogenesis. It's going to come from the muscles. If we overate, and remember what we were talking about, how the insulin signaling is decreased because of melatonin. So now what's going to happen? We got all this sugar in the blood, but our heart rate's up, and we still can't really effectively transport it because we don't have that help from insulin. So both of those, the brain is starving for energy. And when we think about the other thing too, a lot of us have stressful lives, or like, I love watching action movies even before I go to sleep, which maybe isn't the best thing because it gets that brain running and we start thinking about things. So again, something that's going to increase cortisol and compete against our GABA being a neurotransmitter that's going to be more inhibitory and help us kind of downshift. So if there was something that could improve GABA tone and energy availability to the brain, so we're not getting those drops in glucose, then it's going to help us sleep through the night. And just circling back real quick before I go into the what, the things you're doing, if we think about, so now we have some context. When we're waking up, fragmented sleep, that's a cortisol-driven response. And if we see light, if we think way back to when we were sleeping on land and in caves, as soon as light came up and it hit our eye for, I think it's less than 10 seconds, that's what's telling the machinery to get going. The day is starting. So when we see that concentrated blue light beam, that's like stepping right out into the sunshine. That's telling our body to wake up, and that's going to make our brain start racing. So it's going to be hard to fall back to sleep. So for the solution, really, it's so simple. It's beautiful. You'll notice, and I don't get paid from the company, the ketone aid that I have, it's a ketone monoester. And what it'll do is, a ketone can be used by your cell before almost anything. It gets transported directly in there. And when we talk about the load of ATP, it's going to make 4 times as much ATP as if we're using glucose. So it's a really nice energy source. The other thing it does is it improves the GABA tone. So before you go to sleep, if you do like 2.5 grams of a ketone monoester, even though it would give you energy and mental clarity during the day, before you go to sleep, what it's doing is it's sparing that glucose because your body's going to use those ketones.
You're being lied to about strength training. I know because I've been watching this happen for over 40 years, and it's gotten worse, not better. When I got online in the late 90s, the people that were being sold this crap were the same people that I grew up and trained with. Serious lifters, coaches, and people who just wanted to get strong. So I started writing articles and answering questions. My wife Tracy set up the business and we borrowed $1,000 to put up a website and go to work. That was 1998. Elite FTS was never about building a brand. It was about fixing a problem. The equipment, the articles, the coaching, all of it exists because the people who needed the real information deserve better than what they were getting, and they still do now. If you train, if you coach, if you've ever been handed something that didn't work by someone who didn't know what they were talking about, Elite FTS was built for you. So explain the ketones to me a little bit better, because I've always kind of understood that the ketones are the byproduct of not having enough carbohydrate, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So if you have the carbohydrate and then this is the byproduct, how does the byproduct you get out? It doesn't make sense to me. It just kind of like screams bullshit.
Yeah.
Like, this is a byproduct. How can a supplement be made that's a byproduct that's actually going to work and be absorbed?
That's a great question. And that's how I thought about it too. It didn't make sense to me. So very, very specifically, like with a ketone monoester, I'll go into the chemistry, but I don't want people to be intimidated by the chemistry. It'll make the context a little bit easier to understand. So a ketone monoester is basically beta hydroxybutyrate, and there's a bond and it's bound to 1,3-butanediol. So what's all that mean? Beta hydroxybutyrate, if we're on a low carbohydrate diet, that's the ketone that our body makes. And the way that it gets used is it's called an MCT transporter. And that actually works out pretty well, because if you think about MCT oil and ketones, it's just a coincidence, but MCT transporter takes it right into the cell. And when it goes into the cell, it's this clean energy. When we think about where everything that the mitochondria is using is going to be electrons. So where are those electrons going to go? It's going to skip over that first stop in the electron transport chain and go to the second stop. So what happens when it goes to the second stop? Well, it's like if we were going to race and I'm super slow, you'd have to give me a head start, and that's giving the electron a head start. But more importantly, what that does also is that signals are a natural antioxidant system. So without having to take all these antioxidants, it regulates the amount of antioxidant stress so we can both adapt to a workout and reduce inflammation. But let's circle back to the whole question around, if we're eating carbohydrates, how can this work? So if we eat carbohydrates, that's going to get used before if we eat a fat. If we eat a ketone, because it uses these MCT transporters, it doesn't have to be broken down the way a carbohydrate does. It actually gets like the bouncer lets it into the front of the line. So it gets to skip to the front of the line. So since it's going into the line and fire marshal said we can only have so many electrons in the cell, now glucose has to wait until the ketone's gone through and that ATP's been used before it can go in. So
you'd have to have fats in the diet to be able to have the MCT transporters?
The MCT transporters, we just naturally make those.
Okay.
And what they do is not only transport ketones into the cell, but also like lactate and pyruvate. So we've got abundant supply of them.
Right. Well, it's a Krebs cycle. Is it?
Yeah,
I get it. Yeah. All right. So go ahead. So we're back to the ketones for the sleep. I kind of took you down a different path.
My fault. Yeah. So circling back to the ketones for sleep, when that bouncer lets the ketone to the front of the line, and we're going to have that clean energy for a couple hours. Now, all of a sudden, that glucose that's been sitting here, and whether it was a really high meal, now we got a little bit more time to organize where are we going to put that glucose, and let's break it down so we can do something with it, even if we have a little bit less insulin response, or if we didn't eat enough. We don't have to use that energy right away because we got this ketone. So that little bit of energy we still have left from 6 p.m. can now be used after the ketone breaks off. And then when we think about the reason I was so specific about ketone aid, the ketone monoester, is the bond that connects the bioidentical BHB to the 1,3-butanediol. It's like those cartoons where they light the fuse on the bomb
Mm-hmm.
and timing mechanism. And when we think about where's it go, so the BHB right away, that's MCT transporter right into the cell. And then this little timing fuse on the 1,3-butanediol, that gets metabolized in the liver and that gets turned into a BHB. So you get this nice sharp rising ketones, and then you have this nice kind of cruise control from the 1,3-butanediol. And that's why too, there's a lot of ketone products out there. And I'm not picking on Ketone IQ. It's just the first one that came to mind because people always ask me about ketones. That one's 1,3-butanediol. So what would happen if you took that before you go to sleep? That whole load is going to go into your liver. So that's going to be stress on your central nervous system and your liver to convert it into BHB before it can be used. And then instead of there being a timing fuse, you're going to get that big burst of BHB. And then it's going to be nothing. So you're going to get that crash. So it just simply won't work. And when you think about ketone salts, most of those are BHB with a high mineral load. So again, it's the same thing, a high dose of ketones. After it's gone, nothing. And then you're left with this high mineral load that is going to be hard on your system to process. And when you think about, there's a couple other ones that are coming out, but basically what you're going to see is either a BHB or a 1,3-butanediol. And the magic is when you put them both together. And that's the one, all the research for like medical, Tour de France, all that stuff, that's like the Oxford ketone monoester, the Veitch. It's the same thing. Veitch is the one who discovered them, the Veitch monoester.
So it's one of the things that I found that worked. Don't know why, so I'm going to ask you why. Is essentially it's sodium. I'll eat a handful of saltines before I go to bed, and that I think what's happening there is the liquid's being pulled into the cell instead of into my fucking bladder, so I have to piss. Is that essentially what's going on there? It's just sodium. It's just for some. I don't want to throw all the other sodium products. For some reason, aren't working as well as the stupid saltines. It's probably a placebo thing, or maybe it's the little bit of carbohydrate that is with the sodium that's in there.
Yeah, so I think your assessment of that's accurate. And the reason maybe the saltine works better is exactly what you said. Water follows particles. So sodium is going to go into the cell. That's going to help maintain the charge in our mitochondria that makes the energy that our brain needs. That runs on an electrical charge. And the cell membrane has an electrical charge. So that sodium is keeping all those things in place. And then the glucose from that saltine is going to pull a little bit more water into the cell, and it's going to give a little bit more energy to use throughout the night. And then differences in digestive efficiency would determine how long it takes you to break that glucose down. But yeah, I think your assessment's spot on.
You mentioned something earlier, and I wrote a note down here where you're talking about the MCTs, which kind of threw me back into when I was in college. I was taking a nutritional biochemistry class, and one of the projects we had to do for, I think it was 8 weeks, was kind of like just to track the diet that we were on. And I think I was bodybuilding during that time. I was actually off season training for a show, and a friend of mine who was a former Mr. Ohio, we went to see Perillo, right? And so this is during the time to when I forget the name of the diet, but it was the MCTs were huge and the fiber was huge, right? And so I was eating that. So that this is funnier shit because the meals were insane. It's like 7 meals a day. One plate was like a whole head of broccoli. I forget how many grams of fiber, but it was insane. And then there was the protein, and then the MCT. It was like 3 tablespoons of the MCT oil.
Yeah.
So this ended up being something ridiculous, like 8,000 calories a day. And so I'm tracking this whole time, and it's pretty easy to track because it's the same shit every fucking day. It's just over and over, and you're just shitting your brains out all day long. You just think it's part of the whole process. And so the professor actually pulls this up as one of the ones that he wanted to kind of diagnose and kind of break down. And then I'm sitting there, and he's figuring out the calorie load from the fiber, which was like 20%. It was like 2,000 calories or
Yeah.
whatever fiber. It's like, okay, that's going straight through you, because that's kind of what
Yeah.
fiber does. You might be getting some micronutrients, but pretty much you're just shitting this all out. And then it was like the MCT. It's like, that's going straight through
Yeah.
you. So out of this 8,000 calories, it was something like 4,500
Uh-huh.
was actually not being shit out.
Yeah.
Right. Which was, first off, because I've kind of learned since you get away from all those classes, most of what they were saying from a anecdotal standpoint or their opinion was wrong. Now, what they would say from the biochemistry, I mean, it's biochemistry,
Sure.
It's not a whole lot's going to change there. Would you, based upon what you know, would you say that assessment's fairly safe?
Yeah, actually, it's accurate, but it also highlights the brilliance of John Perillo.
Mhm.
I absolutely love him. And
Well, it's a lot of food, right? So, I mean,
yeah.
there is the positive that I was full all the time and
Sure,
I felt like I was
yeah.
eating all the time.
the what's so cool about what he was doing, he was so far ahead of his time. So what we were just talking about, how ketones are gonna spare energy, especially because he did really high volume training and had everybody doing, like, I think when I was introduced to his stuff, it was like an hour of zone 2 every day, and you'd eat vegetables, not fruits, and a significant portion of starch and protein.
Yeah.
And as it got closer to competition time, your carbohydrates would go down, your MCTs would go up, and your fiber would stay the same, your protein would go up. Brilliant. So if we think about what's happening, protein has a higher thermic effect of food. So the same number of calories, more of them are being dissipated as heat. MCTs have a higher thermic value than traditional fats. So again, there's a lot of heat loss through digestion. And when we think about the reason you're doing that hour of zone 2, because at the simplest level, without going into too much granular detail, you have to do zone 2 so that you have an effective aerobic system. And what that means is your body's going to be able to choose between when it's doing those weightlifting sets and you want to have glucose, and when we're just sitting here talking and you want to be able to make that slower energy that's yielding more ATP. So super important. And the reason people would have limited success and some people would have amazing success is because there was a reason for every single thing he did in there. And it's only now, like, I mean, I found out about John Perillo in the 80s and I loved him. And I finally got to meet him. It was probably 15 years ago. And now one of the doctors I'm friends with is actually practicing out of that building. But all the stuff I did and it worked and I wondered why and never knew the reason. And now that I've been nerding out for the last couple of years on the cellular medicine, I can explain everything down to the stretching and what's happening at a cellular level to why these specific fats in this specific order worked. And it's fascinating, but it's cool too when you think about, and this really speaks to, in a biochemistry class, biochemistry is set and it's accurate, but what they don't know about is some of the stretch receptors and how those affect the cell that are going to be activated when we're doing like those loaded stretches, and things that are going to be released to signal protein. And when we're getting that extreme signaling for protein, how we're going to have a higher demand for protein. So when you have somebody that can look at what's happening, what's the cell asking for because of this training, because of this stretching, and how are we supporting it with nutrition as scaffolding specific to these requests, you can see how those pieces fit perfectly together. And you can see if any one of them's missing, that could quickly lead to overtraining or at the best, subpar results.
The biggest takeaway I had from that course was we would track like the protein, in your mouth through your digestive system. Basically everything I kind of laid out a little bit earlier, and same with the fat, same with the carbohydrates, which was fun at the time, right? Because I could fuck with people.
Yeah.
Because that was when there were all these different amino acid blends that were specific for certain things. And I'd sit there and say, okay, yeah, but it's going to get broken down. Then you're going to eat a meal, an hour after all this, and it just gets thrown into the whole thing. And people would be, they couldn't do shit.
Yeah.
And so my takeaway from that was good. But the other takeaway I had from a lot of the courses that I had were the science is the science.
Mhm.
You know, when you get down to the granular basic stuff, the opinion stuff, they were all, I don't want to say they were idiots. It was more endurance based.
Yeah.
It's kind of where everybody kind of fell there when it came into the strength based. But the base was worth investigation, I guess, where people should learn basic nutrition stuff,
For sure.
you know, at the very least, because they'll be able to spot the bullshit,
Yeah.
you know, when it comes out, or be able to ask better questions,
Yeah.
you know, when it kind of moves forward. Hey guys, I just wanted to take a moment because we do read the comments, and one of them that keeps popping up more frequently than not is, I can't believe this video doesn't get more views. Take a minute to subscribe, leave a comment, and share. It really does help. You mentioned the stretching with the Perillo, and I want to put a little context here. So during this one window when I was following that protocol, the training was kind of part of it as well. We went down a couple times to train it. The belt squat from hell was something I'll never forget. It was like a 15-minute set, you know, to where they're actually picking you up. You know,
that's the one that had the handle, like the lat pull down handle, and the weight fell in between.
Yes.
Was on your literally a belt. Yeah.
Yeah. And you would get to a point to where you just couldn't even stand up with your body weight. And then it was just lifting.
Yeah.
You know, and just keep going. And then another thing would come through, and it was, yeah. So we used a lot of the training principles, which let's just say was just more high intensity type things. But the interesting thing during that time period is there were 5 or 6 of us that were all training this way. And I'm not powerlifting at this time. It's just straight bodybuilding to see if I was going to like it, which I didn't. And I liked the training, but I didn't like any of this other shit that kind of went along with it. But every one of us over this 6 or 7 month period of time put on 20 pounds. And I don't want to say there wasn't any body fat that came with it, but it was minimal compared to if it wasn't. You know, it was fucking amazing. I mean, the one dude went up 80 pounds, but there were also other factors.
Yeah.
You know, he started using anabolics for the first time. There were other factors that played into all that. But some of the takeaways I took from that, which I applied to the powerlifting and even to my training today, is when you're dealing with that hypertrophy work, I'm a proponent of training to failure or close to failure, technical failure. I mean, if you got to start muscle fucking it, you probably, you know, probably didn't do that. But because you can do less sets.
Yeah.
You don't need 4 or 6 work sets. You can get it done in one. And then the stretching, which you mentioned, was, I want you to get into kind of the details behind all of that, where the stretching, it was between sets. You know, back then it was between every set. But if I keep it in there now, it's more kind of like loaded stretching at the end of a set or during the end of the workout. Just the way I like to frame it for the lifters is, I think with all the years of powerlifting I had before this, I'm bound up like a motherfucker, right? So you don't do any flexibility work. The tighter, the better, the more weight. So any opportunity to be able to kind of open that up, allowed it to open it up. But I didn't see how that opening it up would create more growth, but it did. Now for the power lifter or the strength athlete, just having that range of motion that's extended past what they normally do in a loaded stretch position is going to create a little bit more durability, you know, for them. But this was an interesting thing because it was in between, it wasn't every set. I don't think it was on the compounds. It was just like on the more like flies, more isolation type work. It was in there. And since you mentioned you kind of gone down the rabbit hole in a lot of it, so what is going on with when I say the stretching, I'm not talking the loaded stretching, I'm talking you're doing the movement and then what he would call fascia stretching, which I don't know if that's even possible, but the aggressive stretching in between. So explain that a little bit.
Yeah. So, and actually, if it's okay, I'll tie in some stuff about the fascia too. That's really interesting. So fascia, just as a frame of reference for people, when we think about fascia, we think about that web around our muscles, and people say they're getting deep tissue work and they're breaking up the fascia. We can just crush that myth right now that what happens is fluid recompartmentalizes, that if we broke up fascia with pressure every time I bumped into the table, I would structurally remodel myself. And we know that doesn't happen. The actual amount of force it takes to mold fascia I'm going off of memory, so I might be wrong, but it's close to this. I believe it's 825 kilograms per square, I want to say inch, but it might be foot. I mean, just an incredible amount. Nobody's breaking up fascia. Now, the really interesting thing about fascia is that it signals even faster than our nervous system. And the way it does it is, if you can picture a trampoline and you're standing on one side and I'm standing on another, as soon as I jump on that trampoline, you're going to, because of the tension in the trampoline, you're going to realize I jumped on it, and vice versa. And that's how our fascia communicates. And that guides nervous system. So in terms of some of the feedback we get from our nervous system, and that's why now they're starting to really unpack when we think about things like how important biomechanics are, why if somebody has trauma, it can manifest as different pressure sensing in the fascia network that feeds back to the nervous system, that creates a signal that's so overpowering that other signals get drowned out. But let's circle back to the initial question about what's happening when we stretch. So our muscle cells don't see any light or anything. They just depend on chemical signals. And when we talk about translating a chemical signal into an instruction for the cell, it's mechanotransduction. And when a cell gets stretched, these integrins sense that stretch, and they give an order to the nucleus. We need to ramp up protein synthesis, and we're going to need more cells. So that's literally how the hypertrophy occurs. And that's why, circling back to when we were talking about those things that potentially would even go under strength training for foundational and what allows the other things to be effective, we touched on circadian alignment, autonomic regulation, so the balance, that seesaw in your nervous system. And then the third component, hydration. And we can circle back to hydration if you want. It's a fascinating topic, and I think people are leaving a lot on the table that I don't think people fully understand what hydration is and how much it can do for them. But specifically to answer your question about the why the stretching in between, there's a load from tension and mechanical stress with the actual weight on the bar, and then that signal's being reinforced through mechanotransduction when you stretch, through what the integrins, or the reaction from the integrins, is telling the nucleus of the cell, which is the control tower of the cell in terms of making more cells and increasing protein synthesis.
So then what would be the applications?
So the applications would be, and I've kind of played around with where's the best place to put it. My thinking is the best time to do it would be one of two times. And I'm still playing around with it, so I don't have this figured out, but what I found to be effective is at the end of your sets. So for example, if you're doing dumbbell press, on the last set of dumbbell press, that's where I'd hold the loaded stretch for maybe 30 seconds. 30 seconds isn't a magic number. That's just what seems appropriate in terms of testing it and seeing if it helps or not. And then potentially like 4 to 6 hours after the workout, when the central nervous system is kind of relaxed and decompressed, that loaded stretching could trigger protein synthesis again. So my theory would be that you'd almost get like 2 post-workout protein synthesis improvements by doing that.
What I found that's worked best for me is at the end of the session, you know, so say if it's an upper body day, because my shoulders are the issue. Mm-hmm. So if it's an upper body day, it would be, I don't like the dumbbells. I'd rather use either a cable fly or something that's more supported.
Yeah.
Or the seated pec deck. And doing a set to failure, right? And then on the last rep, you know, hold that loaded stretch. But after it's like a 4 count or 5 count, 1,001, 1,002, I contract my pec a little bit. This is, you have to have training experience to know what I'm talking about. You don't want to move it. You just want to flex for 1, 2, 3, and then relax, and it's going to go a little deeper. It's like a PNF stretch.
That makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'll do that for 3 rounds which will end up being 5, 10, 15, like about 30
Yeah.
seconds when it's in there. But I'm also able to get about another 1.5 to 2 inches range
Huh.
of motion because of that PNF.
Yeah.
And then for the upper body, it will be like a sled strap for tricep extensions, kind of
Yeah.
getting the elbow joint, getting the shoulder joint, or a lat pull down would be another one. So I'm trying to get the shoulder
Yeah.
from all angles possible with that same type of loaded type PNF stretch. And that, knock on wood, is kept everything kind of at bay.
Yeah.
And I think that's the only thing that would keep it at bay, because everything else from the strength standpoint is you're trying to optimize the shortest position to lift the biggest amount of weight. So it only makes sense to put stuff in like this to be able to balance that whole other thing out, to be able to reduce likelihood of injury and so forth. But I like the way that you explained it, because there's more going on there than what meets the eye. Now, I wouldn't do it first.
No.
Because I think it may compromise
I think you'd leave
strength for sure.
Yeah.
But I don't know about the integrity, because this is brutal if you do it right.
Oh yeah.
It's not like, hey, this was fun.
No.
If you do it right and you're hydrated, which we'll get into that.
Yeah.
Your pump from that will be more than anything you did beforehand. It's like, just don't even worry about the pump until this.
Yeah.
And then bam, it's going to blow. So you mentioned hydration. Expand on that a little bit.
Hydration is fascinating. That a lot of times people come to me, and one of the first things I ask them outside of lifestyle is, how are you doing with drinking water? And most people are like, either I could do a little bit better, I'm pretty good, I drink 1 gallon a day. And then I'll ask them, do you use any electrolytes? And some of the people are using electrolytes. So I'll say, all right, that's pretty good. And then I'll ask them, what if I were to tell you that you're leaving results on the table and you're not hydrated? And they're like, do I need to drink 2 gallons? You don't need to drink 2 gallons, but there's actually something you could do that is going to help. And to explain that, just a Cliff Notes thing on what happens with water. So when we drink water, water is going to follow particles, and something like sodium, chloride, or potassium is going to have a charge, and those charged particles are going to go inside the cell, and we want that. But if we get too many of them, imagine if you have a computer and it gets too much juice, it's going to fry the motherboard. The same thing will happen to your cell. So there's this balance of where you need to have those charged particles in there, but there has to be enough space to operate cell volume. And you need to regulate that charge so it's not overcharged and not undercharged. So when we think about what can create space inside a cell, there's what's called neutral osmolytes. And that sounds really complex, but I think everybody listening to the podcast has probably used creatine. Creatine's a neutral osmolyte, so we can focus on that one. And what happens with creatine, because it doesn't have a charge, it just kind of floats across that. It's called an osmotic gradient. So that barrier for the cell, it floats in there, and it's a particle. So when we get some particles in there, all that fluid that's between the cell and the skin, it's like, there's a lot of particles going in here. Must be a party in the cell. We're going to go in the cell. And that cell starts to swell. And when the cell starts to swell, it's really cool what happens. We think about all of the receptors. So anybody on HRT or anybody using anything that uses a receptor, the protein, I don't know how to describe it without overcomplicating it. Just imagine like there's a little protein barrier around a receptor. And to keep that intact, neutral osmolytes protect that protein. If we dehydrate that, it makes it so the receptor is more at risk, and sometimes the cell will pull it in as a response, receptor involution. So then that same dose of HRT or what people are using might not be effective. The other thing that happens too, we have proteins inside the cell that we need to be folded a certain way. And if the cell's collapsing from being dehydrated, that can cause those proteins to aggregate where they clump together or misfold. And when proteins misfold, just to give people an example that'll resonate with them, if we think about plaques or like amyloid plaques, those sorts of things, those are basically misfolded proteins. So circling back to cell hydration and why it's such a low-hanging fruit, when we maintain proper cell volume, the cell is out of what's called a danger state. When it's out of a danger state, instead of saying if it's in a danger state, what it wants to do is just use glucose because it's the quickest energy. It doesn't care that it's not making a lot of ATP. It just wants something quick. When it's out of that, it can have that flexibility to use fat or use glucose and make intelligent choices. When the cell has volume, the other thing that happens is it's polarized. And rather than thinking about the term polarized, just think about an antenna on or a satellite dish on your home being able to get more channels. So being able to receive signals, be that peptides, hormones, whatever. When a cell is polarized, it supports better signaling. And when we think about how do we do this? How do we accomplish it? And that's why, and Dr. Seeds gets the credit for this. Again, it's important for me to give credit where credit's due. Learned this from Dr. Seeds, never knew this before. So when you take in neutral osmolytes and you sip them throughout the day, what you're doing is you're not overinflating to the point where it's going to burst, but you're keeping volume in that cell. And that volume in the cell is what's going to give you the fidelity for signaling that's going to even allow something like a peptide to work or hormones to work effectively or all those things. When people talk about like, I don't have enough androgen receptors, it's possible you have enough androgen receptors, but just the receptor is not responsive because the cell is dehydrated. And when people think about, well, if I'm doing electrolytes, how much is this really going to add? It all comes down to the volume in the cell not being in a danger state, and what the cell's choices are going to be at that point. That when we don't have that volume in the cell, we're leaving so many results on the table. And really kind of the added bonus, like well, maybe I'll try it, but what am I going to see right away? When you have proper cell volume and this stuff is happening, it's the coolest thing. Like you actually will look a little bit leaner and fuller because that same water that was blurring your definition just got pulled into the muscle cell. So not only do you feel better and perform better, and even your brain will perform better, but you have less blurring that muscle that you work so hard to be able to display.
I've seen this, what you've just explained, play out amongst those who use PEDs, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that, yes, you're going to have hyper responders, the genetic freaks, but then you're also going to have people that just don't respond at all.
Yeah.
And I guess that's going to be some people that just don't respond at all, but everybody should respond to some degree.
Sure.
But a lot of the times with the ones that don't respond at all or aren't responding the way that they think they should be responding, when they increase their fluid, the carbohydrates and the sodium,
yep,
it's like they were taking fake shit.
Yeah.
And then now all of a sudden they're taking the real stuff.
Yeah.
It's a night and day difference, which is crazy. But the one thing because you mentioned the overcharged, which and I know two people that this has happened to, that and I think this is an example of the overcharging to the extreme, where they're coaching football. That I just give you one example. The coaching football, then it's hot as fuck, and then they slam 32 ounces of a very popular sport drink, and boom, they go into AFib.
Yep.
Right. And so I think the dosing matters.
Yeah.
And that, because this has happened more than one time. This isn't an anecdotal thing. And it always seems to me like this is an example of this extreme overcharging of that, because then they got to go get cardioverted. And, in a lot of cases, it won't come back because it's that one-off thing. But if they didn't get cardioverted for a couple of weeks, they may have a bigger issue.
Oh, yeah. And I think it really highlights the opportunity for high school, college, professional coaches to think about when we have that conversation around hydration, especially after that hot day and we're rehydrating, that yes, we need to get these things back in, but the speed that you're going to be able to get those electrolytes in to some degree is going to be dictated by the volume of the cell. So if we're adding neutral osmolytes to that equation, you can take more of that in. But again, to your point, if you just dump in that sodium right after because you're thinking they lost a lot of sodium, you're going from a membrane that had lost its charge, so like a completely uncharged rechargeable battery, to hooking it up to like major generator that's meant for a car, but you put your double A on there, and it's going to fry the circuits, and that's going to be the AFib.
I wanted to ask you about because it kind of goes with that shuttling that you're talking about, the intra workout. And when it's been it was on the map before I knew it was on the map, right? So it's been around for a long time, but when I was first introduced to it, it was also part of that dose of that intra workout of the carbohydrate, high molecular weight, or however you want to explain it. Part of that whole protocol that I was a part of and the people I knew were a part of were also coupling this with sodium and insulin to be able to drive the carbohydrate in. Where I had this type of thing is if it was a 200, because you would always kind of dose the insulin based upon the carbohydrates. So if it's 150 to 200 grams of carbs, and then they're telling somebody that's not using the insulin to be able to do that, I'm like, that's probably not a good thing.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to get shuttled in. And then those carbohydrates are just going to end up being stored as fat, and you're doing yourself a disservice. So with that whole protocol type of thing, I understand how it works with these extra compounds. How would this apply to somebody that's not using the insulin to be able to help drive that in, if at all?
The intra workout carbohydrate. Yeah. So when you have the insulin there, one of the things it's doing is it's taking some of the stress off of your pancreas. So if somebody has been slamming food all day and that pancreas has been worked pretty hard, especially if they're not very insulin sensitive, their ability to release enough insulin to get that into the cell might be compromised. So supportively and almost prophylactically, you could make the argument the insulin could be beneficial. If we're talking about somebody natural, what we want to think about in terms of the cell swelling during the workout, carbohydrates, is I always start with the question, why? So why do we want to get the glucose in there during a workout? Is there an advantage to having it in there during a workout versus before a workout versus after a workout? And I think that would depend on the type of training. I think where a lot of the intra-workout stuff came from is when you look at bodybuilders that are doing like a high volume of work, so you're using a lot of glucose, and if you use a high molecular weight carbohydrate, it gets, the Cliff Notes version would be that because of the weight of it, it's going to pull more fluid with it through the digestive process and go into a cell more directly than if it had to be broken down slowly and metabolized into glucose and then into the cell.
So from a time factor, how much time are we talking about difference here?
Honestly, I don't know the answer to that. I know with a high molecular weight carbohydrate where we don't have to divert as much blood to the digestive tract to break down the carbohydrate, that's why at least I think that's why Milos used the Vitargo and why people like the branch cyclic dextrin. That if you think about what we're trying to do is keep blood in the muscle during the workout. And the reason we want to do that is for oxygen and nutrients. And if that blood has to sidestep to the stomach and then back to the muscle, we're potentially, I think, leaving results on the table. So with a higher molecular weight carbohydrate where the blood can stay there and we can just deliver glucose at the same time, if we're running out of substrate and that substrate is glucose that we need to use, there'd be the advantage there. What I would tell people, natural versus using insulin, is maybe just start with a lower amount, or what I personally do, and this is why I said start with the question of why, that what I personally do, and I should really be sponsored by the Ketone Company, is 30 minutes before my workout, I'll take ketone monoester. And it's for that same reason we talked about with sleep. I want to delay when I'm going to use that glucose. And if I have 30 minutes, I've already had enough time to turn that into ATP and really start humming. So then that glucose that I have stored in my muscle from the meal that I ate earlier that day and the day before, then when my body's tapping into that resource, I'm not going to run out of it because I had something that spared it. And in terms of digestive drag, there's none with the ketone monoester. So the things I want to think about when I'm working out, instead of an intra-workout, what I like to do is a ketone monoester. I want something to improve nitric oxide. So arginine and citrulline are what I use. I know there's a lot of different things out there. Exactly like what you talked about, the importance of sodium charge and pulling water into a cell. I use the LMNT, high sodium, and then potentially I might even, depending on the type of training I'm doing. So if it's going to be more like metabolic work where I'm traveling and I'm just using some machines, I'm trying to get the heart rate up. I might even throw in something like it's called trehalose. It's a type of sugar that has it's a neutral osmolyte also, so it helps with that hydration, protein sparing, and actually improves insulin sensitivity, glucose use, and is kind of two steps before preventing, in terms of preventing protein misfolding. And then what I think about is after the workout, what do I want to do? So I usually actually delay my post workout for 30 minutes. And the reason for that is because when we're exercising, like what we talked about earlier with the fission and the mitochondria, I want to give those guys just a little bit longer to clean up. And I'm not leaving any insulin sensitivity on the table if I push it back 30 minutes. In fact, I'll even sometimes do another capful of ketones so that those cleanup crew has the energy to work a little bit faster, get all those damaged parts out of there. Then I definitely want that mTOR hit. So that's where I'm going to do something like, I like the UCAN starch. Digests really gradually so I can get that insulin level up and I can keep it there and it's not dumping it into the bloodstream. So I'm able to effectively refill those glycogen stores. And then I also use fast digesting carbohydrate, something that is going to trigger that insulin response after the workout. I like Manuka honey. One, it tastes good. That's probably the biggest reason. And two,
pie filling.
Pie filling. I love. Manuka honey though has digestive enzymes that when you're taking in that large amount of food is going to support the digestion. And then for protein, usually a couple scoops of I use a beef hydrolysate protein. My fiance wouldn't be my fiance from all the gas in the house if I used a whey. And I think collagen is a good addition to support the tendons. And then I'll also use colostrum because number one thing your body has to do after a workout is repair the immune system. And colostrum, remember how we said earlier, training increases zonulin. Zonulin can increase permeability in the gut. The colostrum is a great way to protect that gut barrier, reduce inflammation, and support the immune system. So I've kind of checked all those boxes to at least set the stage for if my training was sufficient and I'm making smart choices with my foods for the rest of the day, I should be able to grow muscle.
Coupled with hydration, what are some of the other low-hanging fruit to where you see people leaving more gains on the table than they should?
So the foundational for me is going to be the hydration, the autonomic regulation, so the breath work, and just quickly to kind of unpack the why behind the autonomic regulation, that you can't build and break down at the same time. And it would be like if I was remodeling my kitchen, they started to take out the cabinets. And while they were pulling out the cabinets, they started to try to put new cabinets in. It's just going to be a mess. So we have to balance that. When we're in a sympathetic state, it's giving our body the signal that we want to be breaking down, that we need to have fuel available. So if we're trying to reassemble and we're in this really sympathetic state, that reassembly is not really going to happen very well. So autonomic regulation and that simple breath work, and a trick I learned from Matt Wenning actually is just laying flat on the ground after a workout. You don't have gravity bearing down on you, and taking those deep breaths to regulate the nervous system just kind of jumpstarts that process to get you back to where the body wants to grow and it can grow. And the other really simple, I hate the word hack, but the hacks that are cool, and this even ties in with like shoulder mobility and some of that stuff. The RPR system that I got to learn from JL is quick, effective, and that's nervous system regulation right there. And the other one that's really interesting for people to look into if they kind of want to go down the rabbit hole is the posturology, the Posture Pro stuff that Annette Verpew does. And what's so interesting about that when we think about range of motion in a shoulder, one of the big limiters outside of the structural component is going to be the information our brain is getting as to where what's safe and where that joint is in space. And that data is coming in from how our eyes converge. So if our eyes don't converge properly, it's getting the wrong data, and it's going to think that that range of motion is less than what it might actually be, that we might have the tissue health to be able to go farther. But if our brain says like, whoa, you know, based on where I think we are, this is as far back as we can go, we're leaving results on the table. And
elaborate on that a little bit more. How so?
So when we think about posture, and like if I were to stand up, how do I know where I'm putting myself in space? The inputs are going to come from when your eyes converge evenly. Essentially, that's taking all that information. It's kind of creating like this. I imagine it like it's creating this is here type of thing, and this is where I need to be. So it's telling the brain, this is the center. And then as far as where your torso is going to be positioned over your hips, the way that the weight is distributed on your feet is going to be that feedback also for the brain. And then having your tongue on the roof of your mouth, proper tongue position, that feeds into autonomic regulation. And the simplest way to think about that is when our body's not under stress, that signal that's coming from the eyes converging and the weight on the feet can be heard clearly. If the body's just thinking like, I don't know where I am and something bad's going to happen because there's different amount of weight on this foot versus this foot, even though we can see like, well, you know, I'm leaning on this side, what our brain thinks is, you know, this might be hanging off a ledge and this might not. So there's this constant corrections that are trying to go, and the body won't give up range of motion when it's trying to calibrate because it doesn't know what's dangerous and what's not.
What's going through my mind as I'm trying to process this is I kind of get what you're saying, but that's got to be a trainable attribute, because somebody that, say, a football player in chaos, still the best players are going to still be aware of everything, their surroundings, and taking it all in, but yet they're not going to be in this posture situation. They've trained themselves to be able to react in that chaos situation, which I think would be the goal, you know, of that, you know, where I don't know where this fits in. It's just like just trying to return that back to baseline, because that wouldn't be a skill that you would want to have if you're thriving in chaos. Because in chaos, you have to be able to take in all these things. You get what I'm saying? Where it sounds like what you're trying to do here is to avoid being in chaos, to be able to process all these things.
I should have explained that.
Maybe there's a disconnect.
Actually, the funny part is you hit the nail on the head that it's a trainable skill. So when you think about where does this fit in a program, you could do these. They're called saccades, these eye exercises for 10 to 15 minutes before you train or while you're sitting at your desk. And then when you're in chaos, because that's what you're training for, to have that quick recalibration when chaos is around, that over here, it's relatively easy for me to sit in a chair and my brain say, I'm not going to fall over. But to your point, on a football field, when things are coming from every direction, there's a lot of quick processing that has to happen. So the more you train your eyes to converge together, and the more like when you have that downtime, you can evaluate, am I putting the same, is my weight evenly distributed? And if not, what can I do about the reflex on the foot that's non-responsive or corrective arches, so that when I'm in that situation where I have to be able to react really fast and my body has to just be able to move and not make a mistake, what can I do to set myself up for success?
No, it's good. Noah, do you remember the strength coach that we had out that you did those eye things with?
Oh, Dylan Seeley.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the same thing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So he's out there with there.
The Serrano family.
So you know who he is.
Yeah.
So is this kind of where this is that same type of thing?
Exact same thing. Yeah.
Now it makes sense. Now I get what you're talking about. Were there any other topics you wanted to go over I didn't bring up?
No, I absolutely love the conversation. You ask such great questions, and I really hope that my goal always when I get the chance to talk to people is that they can just take one thing away, that they learn one thing and that it's useful for them. So if I were to tell people the one thing I want them to take away, do this tomorrow, is instead of thinking about all the cool things you can put on top of that pyramid, the peptides, whatever, think about those foundational levels. And everybody listening to this, especially the people that follow your website, are so knowledgeable about strength training. So think about that polypharmacy you already have access to and how you can pull those levers.
Well, I think that's, the more you guys speak about that, the better it's going to be, because I do think those are being missed entirely.
Unfortunately, but my goal is to get it back to that I love peptides and cellular medicine. I nerd out on that stuff. But none of that stuff works without the other stuff. And I wouldn't understand peptides the way I do or even be using them if it hadn't have been for the foundation that I got from learning about strength training from you and Chad and John Meadows, all the guys who have been generous enough with their time to answer all my annoying questions.
No, it's great. I love having you out. It was great. So thank you. We're done.
All right.